the first time the United States fought against Korea was actually long before North Korea. It was long before the Soviet Union, long before People's Republic of China. The first armed conflict that the United States came into with Korea was all the way back in 1871, which was against the Joseon Kingdom of Korea. Again, all the way back in 1871, that was the U.S. invaded Korea. Korea had an isolationist policy at that point, and the United States was like trying to open up Korea, force Korea to open up to so-called free trade, basically imperialism. And I think that's a very important fact because, you know, the Korean War wasn't the first time, and all the way back in 1871, the U.S. had attacked Korea in a clearly colonialist, expansionist move to try and force Korea to trade with the United States. But as far as like getting into like the history of North Korea, South Korea, the Korean War, and all that stuff, you really need to go back to the 1930s. And again, Kim Il Sung, he had fled to Manchuria after the Japanese invasion of Korea when he was very young. And Koreans are, the homeland of the Koreans is the Korean Peninsula, but there is a huge amount of Koreans in Manchuria and also in Russia. Going back like long before the Russian Revolution, there were a lot of Russians in Korea. The opposite. There were a lot of Koreans in Russia. And there were a lot of Koreans in Manchuria. And so Kim Il Sung had fled to Korea to escape the Japanese, along with a lot of Koreans. And he was organizing resistance, student resistance first when he was very young against the Japanese imperialists. And then eventually, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, he organized the Korean People's Revolutionary Army in Manchuria. And he was one of the fiercest leaders of the anti-Japanese resistance in Manchuria and China. He was well known as a very strong fighter, and his fighters were very revered and feared by the Japanese. The Japanese were very scared of him, and they expended a lot of resources trying to hunt him down, and they couldn't. And that fighting for the liberation of Korea against Japanese imperialism, that eventually, along with the Soviet and Mongolian forces, the Korean revolutionaries, along with the Soviets and Mongolians, liberated Korea, first Manchuria, in August of 1945, and then Korea in August. And that's something that's almost never talked about in U.S. history in World War II. U.S. World War II history, the way it's taught, first of all, there's a total understatement of the Soviet role. World War II, the Soviet Union was the biggest, most important part of World War II. The most deaths in any war in human history. Somewhere between 25 to 28 million Soviets died in that. According to the U.S. government, U.S. military, 80% of the German army was destroyed by the Soviet Red Army. So it was 80%, according to the U.S. military. So the Soviets are the ones who destroyed Nazi Germany. I mean, that's not me saying that. That's not the Soviets saying that. That's the U.S. military that says that on record. But so there's the U.S. history downplays the Soviet role in World War II generally against the Germans, but even more than that, most Americans probably aren't even aware that the Soviets fought against Japan. And it wasn't just a minor thing. The Soviet and Mongolian move into Manchuria to drive out the Japanese from Manchuria. Manchuria was the most important colony to Imperial Japan. There are so many resources in Manchuria. And what actually eventually led to the U.S. war with Japan was a conflict between the U.S. and Japan over China. So Manchuria and China was really like the center of like what the whole war with Japan was about. And the Soviets and the Mongolians, along with the Chinese and Korean revolutionaries, defeated the Japanese there. They had massive armed forces there, a huge army there. And the Soviets and Mongolians and Chinese and Koreans liberated it and liberated Korea. And interestingly, the Soviets, in a very, despite all the propaganda against Stalin, it's claimed that he's an expansionist and everything. He could have had the Soviet army and the Korean communists taken over all of Korea right away, no problem, because the United States was not there. The United States wasn't able to land in Korea for a little while after that. The Soviet forces actually stopped at the agreed upon parallel and agreed that the United States could move into the southern part, even though the Soviets had the full capacity to keep moving, and the United States wouldn't have been able to have been there for quite a while afterwards. So the Soviets showed they were very conciliatory. And despite that, once the United States got into South Korea, they didn't repay the Soviets and the Koreans for their goodwill, allowing the U.S. to even be in South Korea in the first place. The United States installed a leader, Syngman Rhee, and started to purge the Korean patriots and leftists and communists in the South. Prior to, a little bit before the U.S. got there and established the puppet government in the South, there were actually people's committees forming all over South Korea and Korea in general, calling for like legitimate elections, including Kim Il-sung and including others, like actual real elections. But when the U.S. got there and installed the puppet government in the South, they cracked down heavily and installed basically a dictatorship in the South. And they had a fake election without Kim Il-sung and without the progressive and patriotic forces in the South. They destroyed those movements in the South and carried out actual horrendous massacres. You could look at the Bodo League massacre and other massacres that happened in South Korea. So many massacres, and in the United States, Americans don't really know about this. But you know who does know about this? The South Koreans know about this. Actually, they know this very well because I believe in the '90s there was a whole truth and reconciliation push, and it's very well known, the dark history of what happened with the South Korean dictatorship. There was no equivalent to that in the North. The North was not carrying out these horrendous massacres. That was going on in the South. And so the stage was set for hostility between the North and the South, with the North, Kim Il-sung, the revolutionary patriot, hero of Koreans for his bravery and heroism fighting against the Japanese for a long time in the 30s and early 40s. With the South Korean government, you had the U.S. install this guy Syngman Rhee, and the generals and the other leaders around him. These people were actually like literal traitors. They were traitors to Korea. These are people who fought on the side of Japan against the Koreans. These generals and other like top people in the South Korean government, you could look them up on Wikipedia even, and they have like a section on allegiance. And you'll see allegiance, Manchukuo, which was the Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, which is basically Japan, and some even like directly Empire of Japan. So they fought for Manchukuo, which was the Japanese puppet state, against the Korean revolutionaries. Some of them even took Japanese names, and wore Japanese uniforms and all this. They were puppets of the Japanese imperialists who were brutally oppressing the Korean people. And to the South Korean public, this was horrendous. They hated this. They had been suffering under Japanese colonialism for so long. The Japanese were extremely brutal. They tried to perpetrate a myth that the Korean people were just Japanese, and they banned the Korean language at one point. They would execute people for any type of opposition. They looted the resources of the country. It was horrendous colonialism of the country. And the United States put those Koreans who worked as puppets for the Japanese back in power in the South. And so the stage was set for hostility between the North and the South already. And there were, according to like if you actually look into like credible sources, like American sources, even um, the it wasn't anything like this video, like how they say, oh, the North just invaded out of nowhere. For a long time, there were skirmishes on the border, back and forth, and incursions back and forth. And Bruce Cummings, who is an American historian, he's basically recognized as like the best American historian on Korea. He speaks Korean. He's been to North and South Korea multiple times. He's gotten awards from South Korea. He lectures for like U.S. government, even U.S. government people. He even lectures for them. He's considered like probably the top American source, and he says that he talks about this, and he's written numerous books about how before the Korean People's Army, North Korea, pushed south, there was constant back and forth, and there were incursions by South Korea into the north. So this whole thing was set, the stage was set. And the way he describes it is basically there was a civil war going on, and the United States basically interjected itself in the middle of it. Honestly, I think that, I mean, that sort of tells you that it's not North Korea that's the aggressor. It's much more complicated. But even that, it's a little bit, that gives too much credit to the South Korean side, because we have to remember the South Korean side, they weren't equal players to the North. These were puppets of the Japanese imperialists who were extremely brutal to the Koreans. And then they were puppets of the U.S. installed by the United States. They weren't like patriotic revolutionaries like the North Koreans and Kim Il-sung. And so eventually when the North, like so-called invaded, actually like responded and decided to push back the puppet government of the South, the Southern forces, the puppet forces of South Korea, they tumbled, they fell, they were like a house of cards. North Korea was able to liberate 90% of the country and push the South Korean forces all the way to this tiny section in the very south of the country. And you have to ask yourself, if South Korea was this democracy that the US set up and North Korea was this brutal dictatorship and supposedly puppets of the Soviets, as they claim, total nonsense. Why is it that, the South Korean people, didn't take up arms? Why is it that the North Koreans were able to push in so easily? And in fact, when the North Koreans and the Korean People's Army liberated these areas in South Korea, huge demonstrations, people came out, in masses to celebrate the Korean People's Army. And the liberation of Seoul, huge crowds coming out with the DPRK flag celebrating the Korean People's Army. And interestingly, during the Battle of Seoul, when the Korean People's Army liberated Seoul, not only were they were fighting against the South Korean forces, but the United States warships and bomber planes heavily were trying to bomb the Korean People's Army, and they could not stop the force of the Korean People's Army. And they took Seoul, and they eventually drove all the way to the south. And during that war, the United States really underestimated the strength of the Korean People's Army and the effectiveness of the Korean People's Army, because again, they'd been fighting for so long in guerrilla warfare in Manchuria and in the rest of China and in Korea against the Japanese for so long. They really had a lot of battle experience, and they really knew what they were doing. They were very strong fighters. And if you look at like a lot of the statements of U.S. generals and politicians, there's this racist arrogance to it that they think because they're Asians, they're saying these Koreans, they can't fight. We'll be able to, one of them even said like, we'll be able to beat them with one hand tied behind our back. And the United States got knocked on its ass by the Korean People's Army. They got driven all the way to the south. During the Korean War, the U.S. general was captured. The Korean People's Army captured a U.S. general. But despite that, despite the effectiveness of the Korean People's Army, the United States really was extremely brutal against Korea. It's interesting because Korea, it's called the Forgotten War. And a lot of people don't know much about it. But you know something? The United States dropped more bombs on Korea than the U.S. dropped in all of the Pacific theater.
Wow.
Which is crazy to think about. More bombs on Korea than the entire Pacific theater, including bombing Japan. Of course, nukes is something different, but as far as like the raw bombs dropped, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Korea than during all of the Pacific theater. And Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, which people might not realize Pyongyang before the war was actually an industrial city. It wasn't like a small city. It was an industrial, urbanized city with a lot of industry, big buildings, and with the U.S. bombing, there wasn't a building left standing more than one story. They completely flattened the city. They and other cities that was not just Pyongyang, but that was done basically throughout. And there's a very telling quote from a U.S. General Curtis LeMay in Korea. This is what he said. He said, "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea anyway, some way or another. Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, what, 20% of the population?" That's U.S. General Curtis LeMay on the Korean War. That's a
Wow.
very telling admission from a U.S. general in the war of what the U.S. did. And it's so unknown. And that's why, there's such a strong hatred for U.S. imperialism in Korea. And if you don't understand what the U.S. did in this heavy bombing of this country, you can't understand what's going on today. And
And the thing too to remember is that like we're talking about a pretty small geographic size. It's not like Korea's not like Japan or China that are pretty sizable. I think in terms of geography, Korea is probably comparable to like California or the US West Coast. So imagine if people like I'm out here in LA, right? Imagine if people completely bombed San Francisco and LA to the smithereens and having to rebuild that anew and being bombed more than any other place in the Pacific theater. I mean, it's just crazy.
yeah, absolutely. And again, it's really unfortunate because it's largely unknown by most Americans. And also, besides that, again, going back to Bruce Cummings, who's the American historian, who's basically recognized as like the best top American historian, even by like the mainstream. And again, he's lectured for the U.S. government. Even he's been to Korea multiple times and won awards from South Korea. Even he said, according to him, um, the the massacres that were taking place in Korea, because there was at the time there was a lot of propaganda by the U.S. claiming that the North Koreans, the communists, were committing massacres and stuff. But actually, Bruce Cummings points out that the massacres were 6-1, and that for every one massacre perpetrated by communist forces, 6 were perpetrated by the South Korean puppet government and the United States. So it was a 6-1 with South Korea and the United States committing the vast, it's unmeasurable atrocities on the U.S. and South Korean side. And he also highlights one particularly disgusting event, and it makes you think of stuff nowadays, like what's going on in Syria when they talk about a gas attack, and they try to flip the script and say Assad killed these people, when in reality, it turns out that it was the Western-backed terrorists that killed these civilians. In the Korean War, the U.S. was doing something similar. There's a really disgusting short film, and it shows pits of dead bodies, and it's him talking about the communists carried out this massacre and blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that massacre was carried out by South Korean forces. And Bruce Cummings documents this, and it's recorded. It's not just like something that's up for debate. It's on record. It was a massacre carried out by the U.S. puppet forces with the U.S. military watching it all happen. Again, 6-1. The South Koreans carried out 6 massacres for every one massacre carried out by the North. So the atrocities were sometimes people try to say, well, there's atrocities on all sides, blah, blah, blah. 6 times the amount on the so-called democracy side against the so-called totalitarian side. And so the Korean War, that's a very important, the historical context. Again, these videos and stuff, like the example you brought up, and any of them, they'll never talk about this stuff. It's you know, sometimes when they talk about the Vietnam War, they'll talk a little bit about the atrocities, but when it comes to Korea, they'll never get into this stuff.
Right.
And but it's all recorded by mainstream sources, like actual, like serious mainstream sources. And again, like you could go on the Wikipedia article for the Korean War. You don't even have to take my word for it. Look at it, has the list of like the generals on each side. You can look at the South Korean generals, and many of their generals were, you could see they fought for Japan. They fought for Manchukuo, the puppet state of Manchukuo, and Imperial Japan. Um, so that just shows you these people, they were puppets for Japanese imperialism, and then they were basically worked as puppets for the United States. These were not Korean patriots. They were the enemies of Korean patriots. The Korean patriots hated them. And eventually, this is another fact that's really important. After the Korean War, well, actually, the Korean War went from 1950 to 1953, and it ended in an armistice agreement. Technically, there hasn't been a peace treaty signed. Technically, there's just an armistice agreement, so there isn't like a peace treaty. So technically, like the war still exists. But you know, considering like the myth that South Korea was a democracy and North Korea was a dictatorship, Sigmund Rhee, the pro-U.S. leader in the South, he was overthrown in 1960 in the April Revolution, which was a popular revolution of South Koreans. So